What is it, little one?
My sister is in danger. Please help me.
The rain turned the neon streetlights into bleeding smears of red and blue as Tiana sprinted down the alley, her worn sneakers slipping on the slick pavement. Behind her, the heavy boots of the men who had taken Renee pounded a rhythmic threat. "Get back here, you little brat," one shouted, his voice thick with a cruelty that made Tiana's chest tighten. Her eyes darted frantically toward a black sedan idling at the curb. That's when she saw him, a man who seemed to pull the very shadows toward him. Sharp jawline, cold eyes, and a suit that cost more than Tiana's life. Without thinking, she did the unthinkable. She broke from the alley and dove toward him, her small, damp hands clenching the expensive charcoal fabric of his jacket. Marcus Kane's body went rigid, muscles tensing like coiled steel. Around him, 3 men in long coats shifted instantly, their hands moving toward the concealed holsters beneath their jackets. Tiana felt the heat radiating from him, felt a deadly calm that was scarier than the men chasing her. "This is either very brave or very stupid," Marcus murmured, his voice like silk over razor blades as he looked down at the tiny girl trembling against his ribs. "What is it, little one?" Tiana Walker had learned early that survival in the docks meant mastering invisibility. At 6 years old, she was a shadow in a city where dreams were crushed by rent and rot. Her older sister, Renee, had always been her only shield. "Stay small, Tiana," Renee would whisper when the street lights dimmed. "If they don't see you, they can't hurt you." But tonight, the Vipers had seen Renee. Tiana had watched from behind a trash can as the scarred men dragged her sister into a van. The same men who paid off the precinct and laughed at the law. Running to the police had been her first mistake. They had looked right through her. Now, clutching the jacket of the city's most feared Mafia boss while the gang closed in, Tiana realized she'd made a second mistake, potentially fatal. "Tiana, get away from there," the lead kidnapper barked, skidding to a halt as he recognized the license plate of the black sedan. Marcus Kane's thumb moved in a slow, hypnotic circle against the child's shoulder, a gesture of ownership that chilled the air. "Breathe," Marcus commanded quietly, his eyes never leaving the thugs in the street. "I've got this. You're safe." He didn't raise his voice, yet it carried over the roar of the rain. "I think the child is exactly where she needs to be." Marcus had been having a tedious night of business until this small bomb with a lit fuse had grabbed his heart. The approaching men were exactly the type Marcus despised: loud, small-minded, and making the mistake of thinking they were the biggest predators on the block. Marcus Kane did not govern the docks through noise or grand displays of cruelty. He governed through a silence so absolute it felt like an approaching storm. As he stood on the rain-slicked pavement, his hand still resting on Tiana's trembling shoulder, the city seemed to hold its breath. In this district, Marcus was more than a man. He was this sovereign of shadows, a figure of urban legend whose name was whispered in the backrooms of shipping yards and the high-rise offices of crooked politicians alike. The source of the city's terror was written in the very skin of his neck and scalp. The tattoos weren't mere ink. They were a ledger of a life spent in the trenches of the underworld. A coiled dragon wound its way up his throat, its scales disappearing beneath a jawline that looked as if it were carved from obsidian. To the dockworkers, those marks represented every deal brokered in blood and every rival who had vanished into the black depths of the harbor. When Marcus walked through the markets, the boisterous haggling of vendors died instantly, replaced by the rhythmic sound of his leather soles against the cobblestones. He never had to raise his voice. His silence was a vacuum that sucked the courage out of anyone foolish enough to meet his gaze. It was this calculated stillness that made the current scene so jarring. The men who had been chasing Tiana stood frozen 10 feet away, their bravado evaporating as they looked into the eyes of the one man who could end their lives with a single, lazy nod to his security detail. They knew the rules of Marcus's domain. You paid your tribute, you kept your head down, and you never, under any circumstances, brought chaos to his doorstep. By dragging Renee into the darkness, they had invited the dragon's scrutiny, and Marcus Kane's scrutiny was a death sentence. He looked down at Tiana, his expression a mask of deadly calm. The child was the first person in a decade to touch him without trembling, And that single act of desperate bravery had pierced the fortress of fear he had built around himself. As the rain continued to wash over them, blurring the neon lights of the city into a chaotic mosaic, Marcus felt a shift in his own internal tides. The sovereign of the docks was no longer just observing a nuisance. He was weighing the souls of the men before him. The silence that followed was the heaviest the docks had ever known, the quiet that precedes the total dismantling of a regime. Marcus didn't need to speak to tell the kidnappers their time was up. The dragon on his neck seemed to pulse with a predatory life of its own, signaling that the hunt had officially begun. The Walker sisters lived in the cracks of a city that had long ago stopped looking for them. For Tiana and Renee, home wasn't a place, but a series of shared breaths in the cold, a constant calculation of shadows and silence. Renee, at 19, had aged in dog years, her youth sacrificed to become the fortress Tiana needed. She had mastered the art of making a single can of soup feel like a feast and a drafty basement room feel like a sanctuary. To Tiana, Renee was more than a sister. She was the sun around which her small, fragile world orbited, the only person who promised that tomorrow would actually come. Survival in the docks was a game of invisibility, a skill Renee taught Tiana like a prayer. They walked the edges of the sidewalks, kept their eyes on their scuffed shoes, and learned to recognize the specific engine hum of vehicles that brought nothing but trouble. Renee took the low-wage, back-breaking shifts at the industrial laundries, her hands often raw and smelling of bleach, just to ensure Tiana had a frayed ribbon for her hair and a backpack that didn't have holes. She was the shield, always positioning herself between Tiana and the leering gaze of the Vipers, the local gang that treated the neighborhood like a private hunting ground. The moment the world broke happened in the span of a heartbeat. They were walking home, the grocery bag between them holding nothing but bread and hope, when the white fin screeched across the wet asphalt, blocking their path. The air suddenly tasted of ozone and grease. Two men stepped out, men with hollow eyes and the kind of smiles that didn't reach their faces. Renee didn't scream. She reacted. She shoved Tiana behind a rusted dumpster, her voice a sharp, desperate hiss. "Run, Tiana. Don't look back. Run to the lights." Tiana had watched through a gap in the metal, her small heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She saw the Vipers close in, their hands rough as they grabbed Renee's thin arms. She saw her sister struggle, a flash of defiance in her eyes even as she was forced toward the open sliding door. The last thing Tiana saw was Renee's hand reaching out, not to save herself, but to wave Tiana away, a final command to survive. The van roared to life, its tires spitting grit and rainwater, leaving Tiana alone in the gathering dark. The silence that followed was a physical blow, a void where her son used to be. It was in that moment of absolute isolation that Tiana realized invisibility wouldn't save Renee. She needed a different kind of shadow, one even the Vipers were afraid of. She turned toward the glow of the docks, toward the only man who occupied the top of the food chain, her fear finally crystallizing into a lethal, desperate determination. The interior of Marcus Kane's sedan was a tomb of leather and silence, isolated from the drumming rain by thick, bulletproof glass. Marcus sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the dash as Tiana huddled in the corner of the back seat, her small frame still shuddering. Outside, the street had become a frozen tableau of terror. The Vipers who had chased her stood like statues, their eyes darting between Marcus's tinted windows and the three men in long coats who now surrounded them with a promise of violence in their eyes. Inside the car, the tension was a physical weight. Marcus didn't look at the girl, but he could feel her presence, a spark of raw, unfiltered life in his cold, sterile world. He pressed a button on the armrest, and the partition slid down an inch. "Call the captains," he commanded, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rumble in the very floorboards. "I want to know who is running the street-level cruise tonight, and I want to know who authorized a snatch and grab on my doorstep." By the time the car reached his estate, the news had already begun to ripple through the city's underbelly like a blood trail in shark-infested waters. The word spread through encrypted messages and whispered conversations in dark alleys. A child touched the dragon. In a world built on the rigid pillars of respect and distance, Tiana's act of desperation was an anomaly that demanded an answer. The lieutenants at the shipping yards looked over their shoulders, and the street dealers suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere. The predator stalking prey, energy that Marcus usually reserved for rival syndicates, was now being directed inward, toward the docks themselves. Marcus stepped out of the car in the underground garage of his fortress, his movements fluid and lethally precise. He watched as his lead lieutenant, a man named Elias who had seen 1,000 murders and never blinked, looked at Tiana with a mixture of confusion and genuine fear. Elias knew better than anyone that Marcus's deadly calm was the most dangerous state he could be in. It meant the sovereign wasn't just angry, he was calculating. "She says they took her sister," Marcus said, his voice like silk over razor blades as he adjusted his cufflinks. He finally turned his gaze to Tiana, who was watching him with wide, hopeful eyes. "Elias, find out where they put the girl. And tell the crews that until Renee Walker is standing in front of me, no one in this city sleeps. No one eats. And if I find out any of our men looked the other way while it happened." He trailed off, the silence more terrifying than any threat he could have voiced. The hunt hadn't just begun. The entire city was now the cage, and Marcus Kane was the only one with the key. The office at the Kane estate was a vault of mahogany and cold technology, where the low hum of cooling fans provided the only soundtrack to Marcus's focused fury. Elias stood before the massive desk, laying out a series of digital tablets and surveillance stills that formed a jagged map of the city's sins. The paper trail wasn't made of ink, but of digital breadcrumbs and intercepted radio chatter that bled through the encrypted dark web. As Marcus scrolled through the data, his jaw tightened, the dragon on his neck appearing to sharpen in the dim light. The culprit wasn't a rival syndicate or a foreign power. It was a group known as the Red Vipers, a mid-level street crew that Marcus had intentionally left in place months ago. At the time, they had seemed like a convenient buffer, a loud, predictable distraction that kept the police busy while he consolidated his grip on the deepwater trade. He had allowed them to operate in the docks under the strict condition that they kept their chaos away from the innocent. He had viewed them as a necessary evil, a controlled infection. But the report on the screen told a different story. The Vipers had grown bold in his silence, mistaking his lack of interference for weakness. The data revealed a pattern of snatch and grab, operations that had been escalating for weeks, targeting the invisible citizens of the docks, the ones with no money to pay for protection and no voices to scream for help. Renee Walker was just the latest name on a list of girls who had disappeared into a trafficking pipeline that the Vipers had built right under Marcus's nose. The realization was a bitter pill. He hadn't just allowed them to exist. He had inadvertently provided the shadow they used to hide their atrocities. Marcus leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking like a warning. The deadly calm in his eyes had transitioned into something far more predatory. He had been so focused on the high-stakes chess of international commerce that he had missed the Vipers breeding in his own garden. He looked at a grainy photo of Renee, her eyes filled with the same defiance he had seen in Tiana. By touching his jacket, Tiana hadn't just asked for help. She had held up a mirror to the rot he had permitted. The sovereign of the docks didn't just have a rescue to perform. He had a debt of blood to settle with the men he had mistakenly considered too small to matter. He closed the tablet with a definitive click that echoed like a gunshot. The Vipers had taken his tolerance for granted, and now they would learn that the only thing more dangerous than Marcus Kane's silence was his undivided attention. The iron gates of the Kane estate groaned open like the jaws of a sleeping giant, admitting the black sedan into a world that felt light years away from the grime of the docks. Marcus led Tiana through the vaulted foyer, his footsteps echoing against the white marble. To the rest of the city, this house was a fortress of fear, a place where business was conducted in blood and mercy was a foreign currency. But as Tiana looked up at the towering ceilings and the warm, amber glow of the chandeliers, she didn't see a monster's lair. She saw a sanctuary. Marcus stopped at the base of the grand staircase, looking down at the small, bedraggled girl who was still clutching her damp backpack as if it were a life raft. He realized with a jolt of discomfort that he had no idea how to accommodate a child. His world was built for hard men and heavy silence, not for fraying ribbons and the soft sound of sneakers on stone. He gestured to a housekeeper who appeared like a ghost from the shadows. "Prepare the East guest suite," he commanded, his voice losing some of its razor-edged bite. "Find clothes that fit her. And food. Real food." As Tiana was led away, she paused and turned back, her voice a small, tired whisper. "Will you find her? You promised." Marcus felt something in his chest, a localized thaw in a heart that had been frozen solid for a decade. He didn't offer a hollow smile. He simply nodded once, his expression one of deadly serious intent. "I don't break my word, Tiana. Get some sleep." The house, once a cold monument to his solitary power, felt different with the child inside its walls. As Marcus retreated to his study, he found himself listening for the distant sound of a door closing or a faucet running. The silence of the mansion was no longer a vacuum. It was a protective shell. For the first time, he wasn't just guarding his assets. He was guarding a piece of innocence he had long ago decided was extinct. He sat at his desk, staring out at the rain-lashed gardens, realizing that Tiana's presence had compromised his greatest strength, his detachment. By bringing her here, he had allowed a vulnerability into his fortress. Yet, as he watched the digital feeds of his security teams mobilizing across the city, he didn't feel weak. He felt a focused, protective fury he hadn't known since he was a younger man. The monster was still there, but tonight, his mercy toward the girl had sharpened his teeth for the man who had hurt her sister. The fortress of fear was softening on the inside, but on the outside, its walls were becoming a wall of fire for his enemies. Marcus Kane moved through the tactical staging area of his basement like a ghost through a machine. The air here was cool and tasted of gun oil and ozone, a stark contrast to the lavender-scented guest suite where Tiana now slept. On the obsidian surface of the central table, a holographic map of the docks glowed with a predatory amber light, highlighting a dilapidated cannery at the water's edge. This was the Red Viper's nest, a place of rust and rot that Marcus had once ignored, but now viewed through the scope of a high-powered rifle. He adjusted the sleeves of his charcoal shirt, the silk sliding smoothly over the jagged scales of the dragon tattooed on his forearm. His movements were hypnotic, possessing a grace that masked the lethal intent behind them. This was the silk over razor blades phase of his operation. There would be no frantic shouting, no disorganized chaos. Marcus didn't do brawls, he did dissections. He checked the action on his custom sidearm, the click of the metal echoing in the silent room like the cocking of a predator's jaw. His lieutenants stood in a semicircle, their faces grim, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The deadly calm had fully descended upon their sovereign, a state of being where his heartbeat slowed and his focus narrowed until the rest of the world ceased to exist. "The objective is the girl," Marcus said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that carried more weight than a scream. "Renee Walker comes out alive and untouched. The Vipers, however, are a secondary concern. They are a mess that needs to be cleaned up. Use the sub-level entrance to cut their power. I want them in the dark before they even know the air has changed." He looked at Elias, his eyes two chips of frozen flint. "I will handle the lead Viper personally. He needs to understand the exact moment he signed his own death warrant." There was a terrifying beauty in his preparation, the way he balanced the cold, calculated logistics of a surgical strike with the burning, protective fire he felt for the child upstairs. He wasn't just planning a rescue. He was choreographing a symphony of consequences. He knew that by the time the sun rose, the Red Vipers would be a memory, and the docks would know that the sovereign had returned to his throne with a new, blood-stained purpose. Marcus pulled on a pair of thin leather gloves, the fit perfect and restrictive. He was ready to reach into the dark and pull Renee Walker back into the light, even if he had to burn the entire waterfront to do it. The hunt was no longer a plan. It was a physical craving, and the razor was finally out of its silk sheath. The old cannery didn't just lose power, it lost its soul. One moment, the air was thick with the smell of rusted iron and the boastful laughter of men who thought they were kings. The next, the world plunged into a sensory-depriving blackness. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic, metallic drip of the leaking roof and the sudden, frantic scuffle of boots. Marcus Kane moved through the dark like a natural disaster, unseen, inevitable, and devoid of hesitation. He didn't need light to find the rot. He followed the sound of a terrified girl's muffled sob, his footsteps making no more sound than the falling rain outside. When the emergency lights flickered on, dim, crimson, and hellish, they revealed a nightmare for the Red Vipers. Marcus's men had materialized like phantoms in every doorway, their weapons raised with a precision that made the gang's street-level pistols look like toys. But it was the man in the center of the room who commanded the most terror. Marcus stood amidst the filth in his pristine charcoal suit, his gaze fixed on the lead kidnapper who was holding a serrated blade to Renee's throat. The deadly calm in Marcus's eyes was so intense it felt like a physical pressure, a vacuum that stole the oxygen from the lungs of every vulture in the room. "You are holding something that doesn't belong to you," Marcus said, his voice a low, vibrating silk that cut through the humidity. He didn't move, yet the lead kidnapper flinched as if he'd been struck. "And in my city, we have a very specific way of dealing with thieves who steal from children." The final outcome began not with a bang, but with a calculated display of absolute dominance. With a subtle tilt of his head, Marcus's team moved in a coordinated blur. Disarming the Vipers wasn't a fight. It was an execution of strategy. In seconds, Renee was pulled into the protective circle of Marcus's elite guard, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and recognition. She looked at Marcus, the man her sister had described as a dragon, and saw not a monster, but the wall of fire Tiana had promised. Marcus stepped forward, closing the distance between him and the lead Viper until they were inches apart. He didn't use a weapon. He used the sheer weight of his presence. He leaned in, his tattooed neck pulsing with a cold, predatory energy. "The girl you hurt has a sister who is much braver than you will ever be," he whispered, his voice like a razor's edge against the man's ear. "She asked me for a miracle. I decided to give her justice instead." As the Vipers were dragged into the shadows to face a debt they could never repay, Marcus turned his back on the carnage. He walked toward Renee, offering a hand that was steady, powerful, and for the first time in his life, unequivocally righteous. The supper for vultures was over. The king had finished his meal. The drive back to the estate was a symphony of soft rain and heavy realization. Renee sat in the back of the armored SUV, her head resting against the window, exhausted but finally safe. Marcus watched her reflection in the rearview mirror, but he wasn't seeing a rescued girl. He was seeing a ghost. For years, he had convinced himself that his soul was a closed ledger, that the ink of his past was too thick and too dark to ever be rewritten. He had accepted the accidental stain of his early years, the moments where he had looked away from suffering to secure his own ascent, as the necessary price of power. As the tires hummed against the asphalt, Marcus felt a strange, unfamiliar lightness in his chest. By saving Renee, he hadn't just rescued a stranger. He had begun a quiet, unplanned excavation of his own humanity. The deadly calm that usually served as his armor felt different now, less like a weapon and more like a foundation. He realized that the dragon on his neck, which the city feared as a mark of death, had tonight become a symbol of sanctuary. He had used the very violence that had stained his soul to cleanse a corner of his world, and the irony wasn't lost on him. He had played the monster to protect the innocent, and in doing so, the monster had begun to feel like a man again. The gates of the mansion opened, and as the car came to a halt, Tiana was already there, bursting through the front doors before the housekeeper could stop her. Marcus watched through the glass as the two sisters collided in a flurry of tears and desperate hugs. The sight was a surgical strike to his remaining cynicism. He stepped out of the car, adjusting his cuffs, and for the first time, the sovereign of shadows didn't feel isolated by his throne. He had spent his life building a fortress of fear to keep the world out, but Tiana's small, damp hand clutched at his jacket again, not in a plea this time, but in a silent, profound thank you. He looked up at the moonless sky, the rain washing over his face, and felt the weight of his price shifting. The soul he thought he had sold for the docks was being returned to him, one act of mercy at a time. He wasn't a saint. He knew the blood on his hands would never fully wash away, but as he watched the Walker sisters disappear into the warmth of his home, he knew the stain on his past no longer defined his future. He had begun to heal, not through penance, but through protection. The price of his soul had been high, but tonight, for the first time in a decade, Marcus Kane felt like it was finally worth the cost. The sun rose over the docks not with its usual gray reluctance, but with a sharp, clarifying light that caught the edges of the shattered cannery and the restless surface of the harbor. By mid-morning, the word had traveled through every vein of the city's underground. The red vipers were gone, dissolved into the shadows as if they had never existed. But more importantly, the dragon had spoken. Marcus Kane didn't issue a press release or a public decree. He simply summoned his captains to the edge of the pier, the wind whipping his charcoal coat around his frame like a banner of war. Standing there, with the rhythmic clatter of shipping containers serving as his witness, Marcus established a new code. The Sovereign of Shadows was no longer a ghost who watched from the sidelines. He declared that the docks were no longer a hunting ground for the cruel. Any man who raised a hand against the invisible citizens, the walkers, the workers, the children who had no one else, would answer to the dragon personally. It was a fundamental shift in the city's ecosystem, moving from a culture of predatory neglect to one of ironclad sanctuary. Back at the estate, the transition was even more profound. The Walker sisters were no longer guests. They were the living symbols of this new law. Marcus watched from the balcony as Tiana and Renee walked through the gardens, their laughter a sound that had been absent from his life for a lifetime. He saw Renee stop to adjust the same frayed ribbon in Tiana's hair, but this time, her hands weren't shaking. They were standing in the light, and for the first time in their lives, they didn't have to look over their shoulders. Marcus felt the weight of his new responsibility, and it was a burden he carried with a grim, newfound pride. He had spent years ruling through fear, but he realized now that the most potent power wasn't the ability to destroy, it was the authority to protect. He looked down at his hand, the one Tiana had grabbed in her moment of desperation, and saw it not just as a weapon, but as a shield. The Sovereign had a new purpose, and the docks had a new soul. The city remained a place of shadows, but now, those shadows belonged to a man who knew the value of a single, brave child. The dragon's new code was written in blood, but it was anchored in a mercy that had changed everything. As the sisters looked up and waved, Marcus offered the smallest, rarest of nods, a silent vow that as long as he breathed, they would never have to be invisible again.